I'd like to start our discussion of the African American frontier with the historical question posed by Dr. Ivan van Sertima in his book, They Came Before Columbus, a book in which van Sertima asserts that there was a presence of Africans in the Western Hemisphere prior to 1492. This is a controversial topic because many people have taken this to mean that Africans, in coming to the Western Hemisphere, bestowed upon the indigenous Americans their superior culture, teaching them agriculture and pyramid building, etc. As you can well imagine, the indigenous people of America would not take kindly to such a notion. So I want to start off by stating very clearly that by addressing this question of the pre-Columbian contact between Africans and Native Americans, I am in no way suggesting that Native Americans were not smart enough or advanced enough to figure out how to irrigate their own crops and build their own structures. However, when you have a frontier interaction between two or more groups of people, oftentimes there are cultural exchanges that can prove useful to historical inquiry. Now let's look at the evidence. In addressing this question of whether Africans came to the Western Hemisphere prior to Columbus, we have to address certain problems with the evidence itself. The evidence we have is archaeological and documentary or written. But there are weaknesses in the evidence that make it very difficult to identify a smoking gun as such that would definitively answer the question. Let's start off with the archaeological evidence. The problem with the archaeological evidence is in the nature of the Spanish conquest itself. As a result of the Spanish conquest, much of the Native American archaeological evidence was systematically destroyed. Many of the Aztec and Mayan structures were built on a larger base structure. What the Spanish did in the process of ethnic cleansing was to destroy the structure, leaving only the base, and thereby erasing Native American presence by building a church literally right on top and in place of the original structure. The Native American ruins that you see in places like Tikal or Chichen Itza were ruins at the time of the conquest and predate the Mayans and the Aztec society, in some cases by as much as 1,000 years. So they were in that state of ruin even in the year 1525 when Cortés conquered the Aztecs. The reason why that's important is that if you look at these structures, they actually record a very detailed history of the native people. If you look closely at the temple ruins, you'll find that they're not smooth-sided, but every stone contains a detailed set of carvings recording the history of the people who built them. It's actually quite amazing to look at. I've seen these temples up close when I was in Guatemala, and literally every block of stone contains these carvings all the way up to the top of the pyramid. So in the destruction of Native American culture, we've lost critical information about the indigenous people at the time of the conquest, and what we're left with is a very narrow window of evidence that survived. Native American historical documents were similarly and systematically destroyed. On the other side of the Atlantic, there's a problem with the documents prior to 1492 because, as we discussed previously, many Africans, particularly West Africans, did not keep records in written form. Nevertheless, we do have some surviving archaeological and documentary evidence that we can draw from. This is an illustration from Ivan van Sertima's book that he uses to draw similarities in the facial features between the massive stone heads found in the Yucatan Peninsula and an East African Nubian chief. He uses these two because it's known that the Nubians and the Olmecs who built these stone heads in Central America were contemporaries of one another. It's also known that the Nubians were a seagoing people who had circumnavigated Africa. The comparison in features is very difficult to make a case for. At first glance, the features of the stone head appear to be African-looking, but you also find many similarities among Polynesian or Native American people. There are a few things about the stone heads that do point to a foreign and possibly African origin. Van Sertima points out the similarity between the Olmec helmet and the Nubian helmet. Additionally, you have a detailed feature that you don't find on Native American people in their depictions of themselves, and that is this facial hair, specifically in the goatee style. Also, if you look closely, there's something else that seems a bit out of place. These lines resemble the marks of scarification rituals that are common among Sudanese people. On the other side of the Atlantic, there is some written documentary evidence that Van Sertima also points to. Remember, information in West Africa tended to be transferred by oral historians, or griots. But we do have a written account from a Muslim traveler by the name of Ibn Battuta, who traveled to the Muslim world and left a very detailed written record of what he found. While traveling to the Islamic Empire of Mali, he documented the story told to him by a griot that recorded the history of Emperor Abubakari's obsession with a transatlantic voyage. As we know, Emperor Mansa Musa extended Mali's influence in the trans-Saharan region toward Mecca. But for whatever reason, Emperor Abubakari was interested in going the other direction. He assembled the best shipbuilders in the empire and commissioned them to come up with the design for a transatlantic voyage. Once his fleet was built, he commissioned an expedition in the year 1310 and issued an order for them not to return until they had reached the other side of the Atlantic or had exhausted their food supply. Well, only one ship returned. The captain of that ship reported to Abubakari that he had sailed until the expedition reached what he described as a river in the middle of the sea, into which all of the other ships had entered except him. Upon watching each ship disappear from sight after entering this river in the middle of the sea, this particular captain turned back. This report simply further aroused the emperor's curiosity, and ultimately the emperor himself set out an expedition across the Atlantic and was never heard from again. The griot's account makes more sense when we look at the North and South Atlantic currents. North of the equator, the Atlantic current flows in this clockwise direction. South of the equator, it flows in a counterclockwise direction, and right about the equator, where the two currents meet, they form a sort of oceanic conveyor belt which flows from West Africa right about the point at which the Mali Empire has access to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Western Hemisphere, with a terminal point around the Yucatan Peninsula, at which point we find Mesoamerican artifacts that appear to be influenced by contact with Africans. If one was to get caught in this oceanic conveyor belt, it would be difficult to avoid ending up there in the Yucatan. While it's easy to get from West Africa to the Yucatan, it's very difficult to get back. In fact, you have to travel all the way back what is now the coastal United States to Europe and then back down the coast of Africa. Thus, not only does this river in the middle of the sea make sense when one looks at the oceanic currents, but it also makes sense in that if Emperor Abubakari were to set out from West Africa on a transatlantic voyage, he would most likely never be heard from again. That would also explain why the cultural exchange seems to be going in one direction, from Africa to the Americas, and why we don't seem to see elements of Native American culture in West Africa. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, explores a wide range of evidence, including linguistic and cultural patterns that crop up in Africa and in the Americas along critical terminal points of the Atlantic Oceanic conveyor belt. It's important to understand that the evidence does have problems, but continued research may reveal a broad new understanding of African American frontiers.